delighted to be joined by Rattan, who has been Dental Director at Dental Protection since 2016, after having worked in the business for over 20 years as dental legal consultant. Raj, thank you very much for joining us today as part of our Business Outlook 2023.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be invited to come back and share this time with you. Thank you for that.
The first topic, Raj, is demand for NHS and private dentistry. What we've seen in the last 12 months is this continued shift from NHS dentistry towards private. The buyer profiles that we're dealing with being very interested in private dentistry. The NHS getting a bit of a bashing at times, but still investors keen on that sector. They're still focusing on it. And ultimately, it's resulted in what we think is the best profile of practice becoming available, a truly mixed income dental practice. We do expect that trend to continue this year. When we look at private dentistry over the last couple of years, we've seen this continued upward curve and the challenges within NHS dentistry, particularly around access. Do you think this imbalance is going to continue that way? Do you think we're going to continue seeing a rise towards private dentistry and NHS is going to be left behind? And equally, I mean, what we're seeing in the press often regarding NHS contracts as they either convert or rebase to focus more on private and plan income. It would be good to get your thoughts on that.
That's a good question, Paul. I think that the situation that we're in at the moment is a very interesting one, and I agree with you completely. I think the last 12 months has thrown many challenges into the mix. My personal view on this is I think I can completely understand why investors are attracted towards the NHS sector. You know, it's guaranteed funding, and I think there's a security that comes with that, particularly when economic conditions can change, and I think that will always be there. I can't envision any scenario whereby an NHS component in the business of dentistry will not be valuable. You know, I think that it underpins pretty much the business model in many practices. Now, what is interesting, I think, is that I think we will see an equilibrium, and I think we will get to a sort of almost a steady state, if I can call it that, where practices will find a comfort level where they can feel that they can deliver the NHS contract, they can reach their targets, but reach them comfortably, and not reach them by working excessively long hours and so forth. And you're talking about rebasing. I have 2 or 3 friends who I've spoken to very recently, and their motivation for rebasing was exactly that. They said, we want to be able to hit our targets with ease and with comfort, not under pressure. So I think that's the first thing to bear in mind. I think the other thing that's also happened, just talking to people, is that people have been pleasantly surprised. You know, some practices and practice owners have been pleasantly surprised that their patients have, in the last couple of years, very readily accepted non-NHS options for funding their care. We've had an interesting situation in the last couple of years. I think when we did this interview last year, I mentioned that we had seen record levels of savings ratios. So people had the money to spend. You know, here we are 12 months later, and we're in a very, very different financial situation. You know, the savings ratios for this year, when they're published, will be nowhere near that, because people are under pressure financially. We also have to think about the fact that people have been pleasantly surprised by how readily in recent years their patients have adapted to private dentistry, and that's given people a lot of confidence. And I think that confidence is going to be the driver for future growth as well.
I agree. It's, I think, a misconception in the market where we've almost kind of pre-pandemic historically seen private practices, or the suggestion of private practices being in an area, a salubrious area, demographics have been positive. But some of the best private practices that we've been seeing have been those core NHS practices just diversifying, giving the patients another option. And we've seen some incredible success stories over the last 12 months, especially.
Yes, I agree with you. And I have witnessed exactly the same. I've spoken to many of my friends and colleagues in the profession, a number of whom have been in dentistry for, 15, 20, 25 years. And they can take a longitudinal view. And they're saying to me, actually, they are feeling fairly optimistic about the NHS private mix in the future. There's other challenges in general practice at the moment about which they are less optimistic.
Yeah.
But certainly when it comes to the balance between the private and the NHS, there is a general sense of optimism. And I think also, Paul, the other thing I would also mention is, we talk about private practice sometimes, and we look upon it as a sort of almost like a homogenous entity. But the way private dentistry is delivered, that there are sort of segments of private dentistry. You have more advanced, specialized procedures that are not available, treatments that are not available to patients on the NHS. You have a range of treatments that are available to patients as an alternative to NHS, and the dentist quite rightly will say to the patient, look, here are the pros and cons of the different options. But also to remember that a lot of private practice, a lot of private dentistry is done on patients who regard themselves as NHS patients, and this is for the mixing route. So I think any practice that's looking at its strategic positioning going forward needs to be very clear as to which sub-segment they're talking about, because the way the marketing is done, the way the communications are done are very different for each of these three segments.
In the autumn budget, Hunt announced around £3.3 billion of funding to go to the NHS, but seemed very unclear about how this would be fed into the dental sector. Do you have any thoughts on that, and equally any insight on what we expect to see in regards to further reforms within NHS dentistry?
If I can take your second question first, I think we need reform. There's no doubt. We need root and branch reform. I think making small changes is not going to have significantly change things. I also think that the money is important, but what is equally important is to spend that money wisely. I don't think more money, I don't think doing more of the same is the answer. I think the funding needs to be looked at in the context, in a more holistic context of reshaping the service, prioritizing the service, and then deciding how that money can be spent within those priorities. If we look at the three main stakeholders, so we've got the patients, we've got the dentists, the profession, and we've got the government. These are our three main stakeholders. The patients want the best care for the least financial outlay. And that's not an unreasonable perspective. Yeah, as a consumer, that's what they want. Dentists want to provide the best care for the most. Yeah, because they've invested heavily in their practices financially, they've invested their time in their education and so forth. So the patients want the best for the least, the dentist wants the best for the most.
Yeah.
And the government is in an interesting situation because the government is charged with the responsibility to spend taxpayers' money wisely. So what the government wants is they want the best and the most for the least. So those three stakeholders, each perspective is valid and is entirely reasonable. The problem that we have is that the three objectives are mutually exclusive. So we will never have an ideal service. So I think the quest for the ideal NHS service is going to always be there. So what we have to do, I think, is to say, okay, there will be some compromises. Where are we prepared to compromise? And then it's up to individual practitioners to decide whether or not they're prepared to make those compromises and continue to work within the NHS, or whether in some cases people will say, you know what, that compromise, I don't think I'm prepared to accept that, so I will come away from the NHS.
But those who rally for change, and rightly so, should recognise that improvements can be made. But yeah, searching for something that's going to be perfect is perhaps the impossible task, isn't it?
I think it is. And I don't want to sound kind of defeatist. I'm trying to be realistic about it. And, I've been in the profession long enough to know that, if you are going to think about change and so forth, let's be realistic in our ambition, because if you're realistic in your ambitions, then you're likely to achieve it. So, but if you're going to fantasize about a future that really we can't have, then we will always have this sense of frustration and we'll always feel that things aren't right. And then the default situation becomes one where we say, actually, it's about more money. Yes, it is about more money, but it's about more money being spent in the right way, in a way that is different to the way that it's being spent now, which is not an easy thing to think about.
I know this is the kind of $1 million question, Raj, but how much of the reform do you think we've kind of been focusing on, or the profession has focused on, that's then meant we've kind of taken the eye off looking after the staff and bringing on careers for young nurses, for example? And what we're seeing just now is almost a demise of support staff within dentistry. I target private practices there as well. They don't have a perfect landscape of a surplus of staff. What do you think the profession can do to overcome that challenge, and try and attract more professionals to the sector? Because that feels like another problem alongside contract reform and rallying for change.
And I'll just quickly share a story with you. I've been a practice owner, I think, for about probably 4 or 5 years. And it was around about the early 1990s. And I came across a book title called The Customer Comes Second. And it was written by Carl Rosenbluth. And from memory, the gentleman was the CEO of a very successful travel business. And I bought the book because I'd grown up with the mantra that the customer comes first, the patient comes first, and so forth. So to suddenly find a book that had the title The Customer Comes Second, it's a very seductive title, because what you want to know is who comes first. Yeah, you want to know who comes first. So it's a wonderful title, and somewhere on my bookshelf, that book is still sitting there. And the message applies as much today in 2023 as it did in 1993, which is probably when I first read it. And what Carl Rosenbluth was saying was, invest in your people, invest in your team, because if your team is happy and your people are working efficiently, they want to deliver a good service to your customers, in our case, our patients. And a happy, well-functioning team will deliver a quality service. And so I think, yes, in healthcare, the patient always comes first. The patient is front and center of our efforts throughout. But actually, there is a message behind the title of that book. And it's also a philosophy that chimes very well with another book that I read in the same time, around the same time, called The Service Profit Chain, which links staff satisfaction and loyalty to customer service. And these are things that are integral. So I absolutely agree with you. I think we have to focus on the internal team first, and we have to draw people back into the profession, those that have left. It's a challenge. I mean, I was reading an article the other day, and I know the American market is very different, but it was interesting. There was a study quoted, I think it was from the American Dental Association from memory, and 35% of the dentists surveyed identified inflation and staffing challenges at the top of the list of challenges that they felt that they're currently facing.
Okay.
So I think it's an international problem, it's an international concern. And for practices, the strategy when it comes to staffing, the primary strategy must be before recruitment, focus on retention. Get your thinking caps and think, okay, what can we do to make sure that we keep the people that we value and the people that ultimately are delivering the care.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. On my journeys, when we're seeing various practices that are on that journey to sell, we do recognise the differences between practices that have been heavily invested in and the support team, the infrastructure that sits behind just the dental practice, in comparison to some. And I know that might sound easier said than done and doesn't always solve the problem. There can still be recruitment challenges and retention challenges, even with those practices that have been invested in, but they're generally far better than those who have just been static.
And Paul, I'll just also add in one other comment, actually, my own experience. You said in the introduction that I'd worked at Dental Protection, as a part-time dental legal advisor. So I did that a day a week. I was also involved with foundation training. So what that meant was that my clinical time in practice was limited to somewhere around about 2.5, 3 days a week. And I was only ever in my practice 3 days a week. And I was so reliant on the team. People would talk to me about running a practice. And I used to say to them, no, talk to the team. They're running the practice. Yeah. And sometimes they would tease me and they would say, we need a visitor's book, Raj, because you're here and we ought to sign the visitor's book. So, and I learned very early on the importance of that philosophy about looking after your team in every way possible. And you get retention, you get longevity, and you get loyalty, premium loyalty, and the service to patients comes in its wake.
I know there was a reference that the BDA made. The NHS aims to be net zero by 2040 and reduce emissions by 80% by 2032. How are you seeing any of these changes in practice, and any insight or colleagues that are operating in a way now that was perhaps different from 12 months ago or 2 years ago?
In a lot of practices, you will have members of the team that represent different generations. Okay, so the current generation is far more focused on the net zero agenda and on environmental issues than previous generations. So I think that's the first thing to bear in mind. So when you say, have I noticed any changes? The answer is yes, I have, particularly in practices where, as part of their recruitment, they've recruited people from a younger generation, if you like. The other thing is, yes, you're right about the net zero. That target is the world's first net zero national health service. That's what they're aiming for. My understanding is that the areas that they're looking at, the obvious areas to me are premises, looking at energy efficiency. I think that's going to be probably the number one, probably the easiest thing that we can all contribute to. In broader terms, I think medicines also account for a significant proportion of the emissions. I think 25%, something like that. In a small group of medicines, like inhalers, for example, account for quite a lot as well. So I think that's another area. And shifting away from reliance on motor vehicles, I guess. Cycling, other forms of transport. I think those are the areas. I think for our viewers today who are looking at this, I would perhaps also suggest that you have a look at it's a document called Green Impact, which has been published by the Royal College of General Practitioners. And I think it's been revised for 2023. And I think that's a very, very good document. Certainly the earlier version that I've seen. Quite inspirational in the way it's put together. And there's some ideas that people can adopt. But I think initially, in answer to your question, it is around environment and personal contribution to that agenda.
Yeah, it's fantastic that it's gathering pace and the awareness around it. I don't think it'll be too long before we actually see the demand for practices that we're selling have a focus around being greener than other practices, and the shift in demand from buyers because of that.
And also, Paul, it's interesting when you said about a shift in buyers, but also from a patient perspective, I think increasingly practices should consider including statements about their strategy in their marketing materials. I think patients, will look at that and will see the practice as an ethical environment trying to do its bit. So, it's rather than it appearing as a postscript in your business plan, I think it should feature in the main body of it now.
One last question I wanted to ask you, and it's more to do with the sentiment in this year, and any long-term views that you have around the sector, and equally any of your own goals for 2023, what your plans are. It'd be great to hear what your thoughts are. There's my personal views. There can be so much noise at times when you see the operational and economic headwinds. But focusing on the positives, the landscape is, there's parts that could be a lot better, but it could be a lot worse as well, couldn't it?
Yes, I think so, Paul. I think so. I think the first thing I would get across is that, it's a privilege to be part of healthcare. I think it's a privilege to look after patients. What I think we have lost a little bit, my very personal view, is we've lost the enjoyment in dentistry. I think fear has overtaken that. I think stress of reaching targets has dampened the enthusiasm. So I would hope that in 2023 we rediscover the joy of being in healthcare, and I hope people start to enjoy their clinical dentistry again. That's number one. In terms of goals, I have for many years wanted to take examples from my own practice, which I owned for almost 30 years before it was sold, and put together a handbook of, what did I learn over 30 years? What incidents took place? So I would like to start working on that, I think, in 2023. That's a very much a personal project. And also, if I can use this to also deliver another message, which is that the profession has been very kind to me, Paul, and my friends and colleagues within the profession have been very kind to me. And I'm very keen now to pay back. Yeah, it's a different phase of my career. It's what I call the payback phase, and to put something back. And if people who are listening to this and watching this, if they have any ideas on how that payback can be affected, then please get in touch with me, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
Raj, thank you very much for your insight today. The conversation's been fantastic, and I'm looking forward to your next project as well and seeing what 2023 brings. I know you've recently published a book on law and ethics. I'm looking forward to reading a bit more about that. And thank you for our viewers listening today as well. We hope you found the conversation very insightful.
Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate the invitation once again. And my thanks to all those of you who have taken the time out to watch this discussion today. Thank you.
Likewise, our pleasure. Thanks, Raj.